A prophet is born. The prophet that would establish a religion which would spread across the world. A religion on the basis of one God, eternal and transcendent. A religion called Islam. This prophet would be the Prophet Muhammad, born in 570 AD. Much of the Prophet's early life remains unknown. The Prophet was born to his father, Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib, and his mother, Amina. His father died before he was born, and his mother, Amina, would die a few months later, leaving the Prophet an orphan. From his early life, he was known as a just and honest man. He gained the title As-Sadiq, meaning the truthful. The Prophet had been praying at Jabal al-Nur, a mountain near Mecca. In the last stages of the night, the angel Gabriel, or Jibra'il, came to the Prophet and brought what would be the first verses of revelation of the Quran. And at Jabal al-Nur, the first verses of the Quran were revealed. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, proclaim, in the name of thy Lord and Cherisher who created man out of a clot of congealed blood. Proclaim, and thy Lord is most bountiful. He who taught the pen, taught man that which he knew not. This new tradition and revelation would be met by ridicule by the Meccans, rejecting monotheism and continuing to worship the many gods of Arabia. However, a few people would take heed and begin to follow the Prophet, the first converts. The message of Islam was not welcomed by the polytheistic Arabs, taken as a blasphemy against the religion of their forefathers and an economic threat. Fearing increased oppression to his converts, the Prophet directed a few of his followers to take refuge in the Aksumite kingdom, now Ethiopia, which was a Christian monotheistic kingdom more welcoming of Islam than the Arabs. The Isra and Miraj, or the night journey. The Prophet ascended to the seven heavens, preceded by a journey to Jerusalem. In heaven, the Prophet was taken to see the preceding prophets and patriarchs before him, including Adam, Seth, Abraham, and Jesus. He saw the 7 layers of heaven before reaching the lottery, man's boundary of divine knowledge. The night journey was an important event. The journey to Jerusalem was an affirmation of Islam's inherent connection to the previous Abrahamic traditions. The Prophet saw the nature of hell, heaven, the angels, and the previous prophets, a monumental point in divine revelation. The migration to Medina would begin on the 16th of June 622. The Meccan persecution of the Muslims had reached an all-time high. Frequent ridicule, torture, and violence by the powers of Mecca reached an unbearable level. The Meccan response to the growing Muslim community was to target the Prophet. Unable to quell the message, the Meccans plotted to kill the Prophet. This plan was discovered, and the cousin of the Prophet, Ali ibn Abu Talib, foiled this plan, while the Prophet left for Medina. The Muslims would be invited to Medina, an important city and more welcoming of Islam, being the home of a monotheistic Jewish community and the centre of Islamic missionaries sent by the Prophet. After reaching Medina, the Prophet sought to unite the various tribes and faiths under a single treaty. The Prophet formulated the Constitution of Medina, a text of rights and treaties between the various faiths and tribes of Medina, setting the stage for an Islamic community. The emigrants from Mecca would be known as the Muhajirun, and the Medinans the Ansar, meaning the helpers. The nascent Islamic state, however, would be beset by the prying eyes of the Quraysh, seeking to remove the Muslims. This was on a political backdrop. The Meccans were losing influence. With the Muslim stronghold in Medina, the Quraysh could lose their regional power. Not long after, a conflict between the Medinans and the Meccans would begin. The Quraysh began to seize all Muslim property in Mecca, affecting the livelihoods and families of hundreds of Muslims. In spite of persecution and boycott by the hands of the Meccans, Islam remained firm in Medina. In retaliation to the Meccan seizing of Muslim property and active persecution, God revealed a verse, permitting the Muslims to fight back, but abiding by the rules of war that God had set. These first began as small skirmishes on Meccan caravans, intercepted from the lively trade route between Mecca and Syria. The Prophet ordered the targeting of the caravan of Abu Sufyan, a key tribal chief of the Quraysh. The caravan of Abu Sufyan was planned to be intercepted on its return from Syria. However, Abu Sufyan was notified and thus took a different route to Mecca. The Muslims followed in pursuit, Abu Sufyan would send a message to the Meccans requesting for backup, whereby Abu Jahl would mobilize an army of around 1,000 in order to crush the Muslims once and for all. The Muslims, heavily outnumbered, would mobilize 313. The Muslims were heavily outnumbered. The army consisted of around 80 members belonging to the Muhajirun, the initial emigrants to Medina. The bulk of the army consisted of the newly converted Muslims, comprising 231 soldiers of the Muslim infantry. The Muslims, however, had only 2 horses, rendering any chance of a usage of cavalry impossible. The Meccan force, in contrast, was significantly larger, consisting of around 1,000 infantry, led by Abu Jahl, a prominent figure in Medina. The Meccan cavalry consisted of 100 horses. The Battle of Badr would commence. The Muslims, prior to the battle, had blocked the wells, cutting water supply to the Meccans. There had also been heavy rain the night before, making the ground the Meccans stood on unfavourable. But through all this, as customary to the Arabs, the battle began with a series of duels. The first duel was between Hamza, uncle of the Prophet, against Al-Aswad. Aswad was killed. 3 Meccans emerged again to be faced by Ali, cousin of the Prophet, and Ubaidah. Ubaidah was struck, wounded, taken back to camp, where he would die as a martyr for Islam. Thus began the battle. The Meccans began a charge into the Muslim lines, which would be faced by heavy resistance. The Meccans were ordered to pull back, to mobilize and regroup. The Meccans would charge at the Muslim lines, which once again was met with heavy resistance. Seeing the Muslim diligence, the Meccans would abandon the battlefield and retreat. The Muslims would be victorious. Following the Battle of Badr, a disastrous defeat for the Meccans, the newly proclaimed chief of Mecca, Abu Sufyan, would set out to Medina to avenge the defeat at Badr. Notified, the Muslims convened a war council and began preparing for war. The Muslims had 700 infantry, 50 archers and only 4 cavalry, totaling to 754 troops. The Quraysh had 3,000 infantry and 200 cavalry, totaling to 3,200 troops. The Prophet strategically placed his army at the foot of Mount Uhud. However, the Muslim left flank was vulnerable. Thus, a group of archers was stationed, strictly ordered not to depart from their positions, even if Muslim victory was in sight. The battle began with a charge from the Meccan cavalry. Thwarted by the Muslims, the Meccan standard bearer, Talha, challenged the cousin of the Prophet, Ali, to a duel. Ali struck him down, whereby his brother would pick up the standard, also being struck down. The Muslims began their charge against the Meccan lines, which pushed back the Meccans. The Muslims had begun to pierce Meccan lines. The archers stationed began to join the main Muslim lines against the Prophet's orders. Seeing this, the Meccan cavalry charged the exposed flank for the Muslims. A few archers remained, but were cut down. At this sight, the Muslims pulled back to the mountain. The Meccans did not follow in pursuit, and the battle ended. The battle is regarded by most Islamic scholars as a defeat. In the Quran, the reason for the Muslim defeat is recounted. In a verse revealed by God, some Muslims' desire for war bounty and cowardice were the factors for defeat. A few tribes who did not accept the aforementioned constitution of Medina were expelled. As revenge, the tribe of Banu Nadir began to plot with the Quraysh and various other tribes on another attack on Medina. Together, they would form the Confederates, and with increased bloodlust for the Muslims began a prolonged siege. The Muslims had around 3,000 infantry with negligible cavalry, and the Confederates around 10,000 infantry, one of the largest armies fielded in Arabia. One of the associate tribes, the Banu Qurayza, renounced a treaty with the Muslims. Afraid of the large Confederate army, this quickly grew to alarm the Muslims. Fearing being enveloped, a secret convert from the Confederates snuck into the Prophet's camp and asked how he could best assist the Muslims. He was directed to sow discord between the Qurayza and the Confederates. The convert told the Qurayza to ask for some Confederate leaders in exchange for assistance, then told the Confederates that the Qurayza wished to take Confederate leaders and bring them to the Prophet. This strategy sowed discord between the two, and the Confederates began to split, and in the dead of night began to abandon the siege. After the Battle of the Trench, the Prophet signed the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, a 10-year truce between the Quraysh and the Muslims. During this period, once fearful Muslims would practice openly. However, this treaty was soon breached by the Quraysh. Unable to re-establish the treaty, war would begin. The Muslims would raise an army of 10,000, the largest Muslim army ever fielded. The march to Mecca would begin, with the intent of finally demonstrating a victory of monotheism against polytheism. The Quraysh did not have ample time to mount a defence, and took refuge in their homes. The Muslims entered the city, which was bloodless. The Muslims toppled the idols, and the first prayer in Mecca would begin. Islam would achieve victory in Arabia. Islam's rise would be a story of persistence and perseverance in the face of the powers that be. Islam brought to Arabia a great social upheaval. No longer were gods of stone, clay and wood worshipped, but an utterly transcendent God, unable to be represented by what man's hands craft. The later caliphates would spread Islam from the edge of China to the edge of Spain. Islam would become a world religion, and has persisted for millennia, and still does to this day.